Welcome to another Chess.com podcast. Now last week we looked at the Petrov defence where black played an incorrect move, although innocuously looking it ultimately decided the game and white was able to capitalise and win. Now I've had a request to do a few more of these quick wins by white. They're not quite trapping lines, but what they are lines where black, or white in some cases, plays an incorrect move and how the other player can instantly capitalise. You should always be aware of these lines. Now they're not trapping lines, they're simply the main line or a variation where the opponent has gone wrong. I wouldn't suggest that you learn trapping lines and play trapping lines because they will not make you a better player. It's good to learn them so you know how to avoid them, but if you avoid a trapping line you tend to come out a bit better than the person who set the trap up, and this is why you should never do it yourself. Now this is in the Pirc defence, sometimes called the Pirc defence, but it's actually pronounced Pirc. And it's e4, g6, d4, bishop to g7, knight to f3, d6. White continues with knight to c3, knight to d7, and bishop to c4. It's all mainline up to here. Now bishop c4 isn't always played, sometimes bishop d3 is played, and sometimes the dark squared bishop is brought out. So black might know this, might not know what to do in this position, and may develop his knight to f6. In this case, white has won this game. There are a number of ways to win from this position. To name but one would be to push the e5 pawn, or the pawn to e5, but simpler still is just bishop takes f7 check, and the game is over. If the king takes an f7, the knight comes to g5 with check, and no matter where the king goes, white is going to win a great deal of material. If the king goes back to e8, then simply knight to e7, trapping the queen. If the king went to f8, then again knight to e6, forking the king and the queen and winning the queen. If the king went to g8, knight to e6, queen to e7, knight to c7, or knight takes c7, sorry, queen to d8, knight takes a8, and then white will be able to rescue his knight after b5, e5, d takes e5, d takes e5. The white knight will be able to come to d5 and help the knight on a8 out, or simply bringing the queen up to d5 at a later time will also be able to assist in saving the knight. Another move is queen to f3. Very briefly we'll go back and we'll see the other option here, which is if the king doesn't take on f7 but simply plays f8, probably the best move in this position. This time the knight comes to g5 as usual, eyeing up the e6 square. The only way to make space for the queen is to play knight to b6, where you can drop the knight back to b3, still eyeing up the square, the e6 square. After e6, knight takes e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6. White two pieces up with the bishop, 2 pawns up with the bishop pair, and should have no problems in converting this into a full point. We're going to look at 2 more of these Pirc and modern defences. We're going to look at 1 more this week and 1 next week. This is our second example game in the Pirc defence, where white makes a quick win. Now I want to point out that all these examples and all these games I'm going through can be found on mega databases, and very often they're played between international masters and grandmasters. So don't think just because these lines look simple that they're only played by amateurs. In fact, that's not true. They're played by people at the highest levels. e4, g6, d4, bishop g7, and this time rather than bring the knight to f3 to support the pawn on d4. White plays c3. d5 is played, and what black's going to do here is trying to isolate the d4 pawn and start to exert pressure with his bishop and his queen on the d4 square, and later bring a knight into the attack. E takes d5, queen takes d5, knight to f3 to support that pawn, c5, bishop e3, c takes d4, c takes d4. So although white is better developed, the black player has managed to exert good pressure on the d4 pawn and isolated it. So how should the black player carry on here? Well, the easiest response, and possibly the best response here, is simply to play knight to f6. But many times the black player might overlook knight to f6 and try and exert more pressure on d4. d4 cannot easily be defended by the other black pieces. It would take the knight 2 moves to protect the pawn. No pawn can support d4, and the light square bishop is obviously useless. So the black player may play knight to h6, hoping to bring the knight to f5 and exert pressure on the d4 square that way. Unfortunately, the black player, in playing knight to h6, overlooks a lethal double attack opportunity by white, which is queen to c1. White is now threatening to take on both the h6 square and also on the c8 square. White cannot hold both of these pieces, and the position is lost, as black will be a piece down. Next week we're going to look at the modern defence and an incorrect line played by black in the modern defence, and how white can easily capitalise on it. Keep your suggestions coming for these Chess.com podcasts.